Hi guys, in most of my videos, particularly for immunology and microbiology, I talk about the immune response as the good guy, the thing that is going to save us from all of the creepy crawly bugs out there that want to kill you. And by and large, that's true. Without an immune response, we're in deep trouble when it comes to fighting pathogens. But that doesn't mean the immune response is always the good guy. And it's now time to start talking about the things the immune response does to us that aren't so great. And particularly, that's where the concept of hypersensitivity comes in. Hypersensitivity reactions are basically inappropriate immune responses. These are immune responses that are made to antigens that we never should be responding to in the first place. We either shouldn't be responding to them because they're self-antigens and we're tolerant to them, or because they're innocuous. They might be foreign, but they don't harm us, so we are kind of failing that danger, not danger signal that we learned about all the way back when we first started talking about PAMPs and PRRs. All right, so let's talk about the two types of responses. So you can make responses to non-pathogenic foreign antigens, and some of those can lead to tissue damage and even death. And the best example of this would be like an anaphylactic reaction. Most of us in this day and age have heard about anaphylactic shock or anaphylactic reactions. Typically, these are the result of allergies, and most commonly, I think the thing that people most often think of when they think of anaphylactic reactions are either food or bee stings. So food is supposed to not cause a reaction, but in some individuals, they respond to peanut antigen, say, with an immune response that is so potent that it can actually lead to swelling of the airway, and obviously that's not good for maintaining life. The other way to kind of think of these responses to non-pathogenic foreign antigens would be something like an intolerance, okay? So an intolerance would be something like patients with celiac disease. Now, this is not an allergic response. It is actually classified as a hypersensitivity, which means it can sometimes be referred to as an autoimmune disease. But that's actually not entirely true. And let me explain why. Responses to self-antigens or autologous antigens are autoimmune, right? Because it's auto meaning to self and immune. So celiac disease, while it's certainly a hypersensitivity and an intolerance that is often classified as an autoimmune disease, is actually still against a foreign antigen. It's against gluten antigen. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we cover celiac. So let's talk about autoimmune disease kind of in its own right. These are self-antigens that we're responding to. So this would be something like responding to pancreatic islet cells, right? So those are your own pancreatic islet cells. You're making an immune response to them, you're destroying them, and that's leading to diabetes. This is when the body makes a response to itself, and then it's referred to as an autoimmune response. Now, I want to draw a line here. Just because you make an autoimmune response does not mean that you have an autoimmune disease, okay? These things are not equal, okay? People make self-responses all the time. For example, there are two antibodies, anti-nuclear antibody and RF factor or rheumatoid factor. So you might see these as ANA or RF. These can be found in approximately 5 to 15% of the healthy population. Notice I said healthy. Even though these are antibodies to nuclear antigens or to self-antigens that patients have within them, they're not experiencing any symptoms. So the very presence of an autoantibody does not mean disease. However, if a patient has disease, the likelihood that they have a high titer of autoantibodies goes up, okay? So it's kind of one of those square rectangle things. Okay, there are roughly 4 different types of autoimmune disease or hypersensitivity reactions, as they're more classically called. And to kind of keep them straight, I want you to remember the acronym ACID, okay? So type 1 is referred to as the allergic response. Type 2 is the cytotoxic response. Type 3 is the immune complex response. And type 4 is the delayed response. if you can keep these 4 types in mind, you can understand the mechanism by which each of these types of hypersensitivity take place. And we'll go into that a little bit later in this video. All right, so what actually causes autoimmune disease? The short answer is nobody knows. And the long answer is it's complex. We know that there are things that are involved, and we also know that it's a multifactorial picture. For one thing, we know that autoimmune disease significantly disproportionately affects women compared to men. So if you look here, this is, I think, a really nice diagram that shows a wide variety of autoimmune diseases and the ratio of women who suffer from the disease compared to men. So for example, lupus, a pretty common one, affects women 9 times as often as it affects men. The same can be said, scleroderma, it's a 3-to-1. Rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis are about as even as it gets, and they're 2.5-to-1 and 2-to-1 respectively. So women tend to have a much higher incidence of this. So why is that? You know, there's a lot of theories behind what causes it and what doesn't. And so if we look at kind of the 3 theories behind what causes autoimmune disease, you have genetic components, environmental components, and immune regulation. So anytime you have a hypersensitivity disorder, you also have a failure of the peripheral and central tolerance mechanisms that are supposed to protect us from self-directed immune responses. So that's where immune regulation comes in. Basically, I've talked about this before, but we want our immune system in balance. If we have not enough T regulatory cells and too many type 1 Th1 helper cells, that's an inflammatory environment. If we have not enough Tregs and too much IgE or too many mast cells or too many Th2 cells, that's an inflammatory environment. And both of those environments mean that we have a lack of immune regulation that's going to lead to disease, okay? So the key with immune regulation is balance, and that's kind of all I'm going to say about this here, and this is something that we'll work through as we talk about specific diseases. Let's move over to environment. We know environment plays a possible role in autoimmune disease, but what role is a little unclear. There have been numerous etiologic agents, so viral and bacterial infections, that can contribute to autoimmune responses. So for example, some chronic infections like tuberculosis can lead to destruction of healthy lung tissue. The type 2 hypersensitivity rheumatic fever only occurs really after infection with certain strep pyogenes infections. So an infection certainly can kick off an autoimmune event. However, that isn't the answer for every autoimmune disease. There have been so many studies that have tried to pin an etiologic agent on multiple sclerosis that, you know, they're countless, and Epstein-Barr has been blamed and other viruses have been blamed. I think some of the other herpes viruses have been blamed, but no single etiologic agent has been identified. Environment can also mean what we eat and what we see. So for example, vitamin D deficiency is highly associated with development of hypersensitivity diseases. If you look at a map of the world, if you look at people who live along the equator, their incidence of hypersensitivity is much lower than people who live in the northern hemisphere, where we kind of don't see the sun for a long period of time. Genetics also plays a role, but it's not the whole story. If you look at twin studies, particularly for multiple sclerosis, there's only a 30% concordance rate between twins with multiple sclerosis. So that means there's a 30% chance that if your homozygous identical twin has MS, that you will catch it as well. So that right there says that genetics isn't the full story, because these people have exactly the same genes and they are not having the exact same life experience. So it's a very complex question to answer what causes autoimmune disease, but we can safely say that there are genetic determinants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's environmental triggers, and the immune response plays a huge role in controlling autoimmune disease and propagating it as well. Okay, so this is probably the best example of the role that genetics plays in autoimmune disease. So I've talked about HLA allotypes. There are so many different HLA types for both MHC class 1 and MHC class 2. And for many autoimmune diseases, a kind of predisposition to develop that disease is found in the HLA type of the patient. So for example, if you have HLA-A3, you're at higher risk of developing hemochromatosis. Celiac disease is actually probably the best indicator of it. Something like 98% of celiac patients are either HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8. It's so associated with it that I've heard some gastroenterologists say that rather than doing a celiac sensitivity test, sometimes they'll do a haplotype test. Because if you're not HLA-DQ2 or DQ8, it's highly unlikely that you actually have celiac disease. Not impossible, but very unlikely because there's such a strong association. I basically took this directly out of the 2018 First Aid Step 1 book. And this is something that I've been told over and over and over again that you just have to know. You have to memorize this. So I do expect you to know which HLA types are associated with which disease. Even if you don't know the disease, I want to be able to say which HLA type is associated with psoriatic arthritis. So you need to be able to know this table cold. All right, so I've mentioned previously that there's this classification system for these 4 types of hypersensitive responses. And these are known as the Gellin-Coombs classification system. So we have 4 different types, and they have very different mechanisms of action that lead to disease and pathology. I just want to point out here that there are videos for each type of hypersensitivity, 1 through 4. They're osmosis videos. I wrote them, or at least I reviewed the scripts with the script writer at Osmosis. So you can go ahead and read those, but or watch those. I do recommend you read the notes though, because they are more detailed. And if you have questions about the mechanism or how things work, or you want more information on it, I'm happy to make more in-depth videos for each type of hypersensitivity. The important thing I want you to understand out of this is kind of the base mechanism that leads to either tissue destruction or disease for each type. We're going to work with this a lot throughout the next 2 years of your curriculum every time we encounter a potential hypersensitivity disease. Okay, so let's start with type 1. Okay, type 1 is often known as the allergic response, or another term for it is atopy or atopic response. And you can see in the notes, I go into much more detail on atopy. I talk about the atopic triad and atopic march. So make sure you understand those concepts as you're going through. Patients experiencing allergic reactions are genetically primed to produce more IgE antibodies to seemingly harmless antigens in the environment. So for example, I'm an allergy sufferer. I'm allergic to dust and tree pollen and mold. But then there are other people who are allergic to food like peanuts or shellfish or something like that. You can also be allergic to medications. So like a common one for that would be like penicillin, or contact allergens like latex or laundry detergent. About 10 to 20% of the population supposedly experiences allergy. I actually think that number is a lot higher than that. Just a lot of people kind of manage it themselves with over-the-counter medications. And this rate is actually increasing significantly in industrialized countries like the United States. So allergy responses are generally thought to be mediated by IgE, but IgE isn't working alone. So if we've gotten to IgE, that means T cells were involved somewhere, right? Because the B cell has to be instructed by the Th2 T helper cell through cytokines like IL-4 and IL-13 and IL-5 to develop into a plasma cell and secrete IgE. All of that happens the first time, which is called the priming event. So that's the first time you experience the antigen. Your body is going to make these plasma cells that secrete IgE to that allergen or allergy antigen, okay? Then what happens is that the IgE binds to FC, oh, you can't really see that, FC epsilon receptors on the mast cell. And the mast cell basically becomes armed with IgE antibodies, okay? Then the next time you see that allergen, the allergen cross-links the IgE that's bound to the mast cell, and it triggers the mast cell to degranulate, basically spewing out histamines and prostaglandins and bradykinins and leukotrienes and all sorts of nasty stuff that leads to those feelings of allergies, right? So maybe difficulty breathing, increased mucus secretion, contraction of smooth muscles, vascular permeability, edema, all of that. And that's what can eventually lead to disease. That's kind of the immediate atopic response. You also get cytokine that's produced here, and that can actually lead to a late response, which is basically due to cellular infiltrate by lymphocytes and eosinophils and all sorts of other cells. Okay, on to type 2. Type 2 is typically considered an antibody-mediated disease. In type 2, we're talking about antibodies against cell-bound, and that's really, really important. So this can either be cell-bound or like cell tissue-bound. These are extracellular antigens, haptens maybe, anything that can bind strongly to the host cell. So what they're actually showing here is an example of hemolytic anemia. And so let's say that these right here are little penicillin antigens that got stuck to the red blood cell. And then you made, typically they're IgG, but they can be IgM, antibodies to that penicillin antigen, and it binds to the red blood cell, and that induces complement, and then complement basically destroys the cell. Type 2 autoimmune diseases are typically organ specific or tissue specific, which we'll talk about again in a minute. And the complement system becomes activated, as does ADCC, which basically mediates cytotoxicity. And that's why this is referred to as the cytotoxic immune response. In some cases, though, and here's where I'm going to get confusing, the IgG doesn't lead to cell death necessarily, but it actually just interferes with the way the cell is working. Or by blocking receptor ligand interactions. A really great example of this would be a disease like myasthenia gravis and Graves' disease. In this case, the antibody binds to specific receptors, be it thyroid stimulating hormone receptor in Graves' disease or the acetylcholine receptor in myasthenia gravis. And when the antibody binds there, that means that either thyroid stimulating hormone or acetylcholine can't bind to the receptor, and then the tissue doesn't work. Again, watch the type 2 video, and then if you have any questions, contact me and we can go into it more. All right, type 3 hypersensitivities. This is the immune complex hypersensitivity. What does that mean? An immune complex is an antigen that is bound to its antibody, okay? That's all it is. It's a fancy word for that combination. When you have immune complexes, that means you've got an antibody bound to a soluble antigen, and that's pretty common in type 3 hypersensitivities. Soluble antigens would include things like DNA that can get lysed from our cells when cells lyse or removed from our cells, and just kind of other soluble proteins and antigens that are found. Immune complexes are meant to be cleared, so things like macrophages and whatnot would basically pick it up, so this polymorphonuclear would pick up the antigen and pull it in and destroy the immune complex, and that's part of how they get cleared. But if you have too many immune complexes, a couple things can happen. You can have kind of a lattice that gets really large and then is difficult to clear. Also, you can have problems where the antibodies kind of deposit in tight spaces, and just like they did in type 2, now they're going to activate complement, which is going to be highly inflammatory. So this is kind of what happens in like glomerulonephritis, because we're supposed to be filtering those immune complexes out, but they're too big to get through our filtration system. So they get stuck in these tight spaces. Complement becomes activated, and that leads to mass inflammation. And that's actually what leads to clinical disease there. All right, type 4. Type 4 in our acronym earlier was referred to as delayed, which that is kind of how we remember it. But really what I want you to think of with type 4 is T cells. Okay, this is the hypersensitivity where T cells are actively acting as the effectors. So you have work of Th1 CD4 helper cells and CD8 positive T cells that are basically going to cause disease. Most commonly, the one that I think of are MS and diabetes. Those are both good examples of type 4 hypersensitivities where CD8 positive and CD4 positive T cells are playing an active role in pathology and disease. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about systemic versus tissue specific, okay? With the exception of type 1 hypersensitivities, which are that atopic response, we can further classify diseases by whether or not the disease is caused throughout the body or due to the work of a target organ, okay? Typically, type 2 and type 4 diseases are considered organ-specific autoimmune diseases. Now, this can be a little tricky, but for example, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, really the only target is the thyroid. In multiple sclerosis, the only target is typically the brain, right? So, or the central nervous system. So we're in a specific target tissue. Now, that doesn't mean that patients won't feel systemic symptoms. Particularly if you think about multiple sclerosis, if you attack the central nervous system, you could have issues with your eyesight, you could have issues with cognition, but you could also have gastrointestinal issues or urinary issues based on what part of the central nervous system is being targeted. Same with the thyroid. If you mess with the thyroid, somebody might be hungrier than usual or more tired than usual, and all of these can be associated just with the activity of that organ, because even though all of the disease is taking place there, our organs all work together to make a functional human. Okay, systemic autoimmune disease, this is where the reaction is happening kind of throughout the body, and it manifests kind of throughout the body. So I think the kind of prototypical example for this is systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or lupus. It has a lot of different names. But basically, you get those antibodies specific to DNA and other nuclear components. And then you get immune complexes, and they deposit in tight areas like the glomeruli. You can also get IgG autoantibodies directed at like a cell surface and matrix antigens, and that results in cellular damage either by complement or binding of a fixed antibody or complement components to specific tissues. So when it happens throughout the body, that's a systemic response. When it happens at a fixed tissue site, that's an organ-specific response, but you may still have systemic symptoms.